That
All right.
sounds
So,
familiar.
yes, we got back to recording in progress.
Yeah.
Better than last week already, right? And I'll just start by saying I think at least the news in American politics is much better this week than it's been in quite a while. And I think you're quite used to hearing doom and gloom from me. And I like to say I call it as I see it. And so if I don't think the news is good, I'm not doing you any favor by sugarcoating it. I do think that the news this week and maybe for the last 2 weeks has really hit an inflection point. Obviously, we won't really know the outcome of this election for another 90 plus days. If you're counting, I think we're down to 94 now. But having said all of that, a few weeks ago, right, when Joe Biden was still the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, when his decline in the polls was precipitous and the consequence of a disastrous performance in a debate that confirmed the suspicion of many Americans that he was simply too old and that the Democratic Party and Biden himself and his administration had been sheltering him from public exposure in order, in a sense, to hoodwink the American public about the fact that he was not capable of being an effective president. I posed the question: can our institutions rescue us from our politics? And my answer was no, I don't think they can in 2024. I think that there's been too much decay in our institutions and too much of an effort to hijack or manipulate those institutions, that the two political parties had presented us with a really terrible choice in 2024, that the media was not going to help us to get to the bottom of a lot of the troubling disinformation that was circulating in our public sphere, that our Supreme Court was increasingly dismantling the checks and balances and the principles of the rule of law. And so that really it was going to come down to what the American people did in this election. And I was deeply concerned that it was trending in the direction of a would be autocrat being elected and perhaps receiving a landslide victory, gaining control of both houses of Congress, and in a setting where the institutional guardrails had come down. And so there would be little constraint on him working his autocracy out in a way that he had failed to in his first term as president. And we talked a little bit about the literature on how democracies die, and that this is a typical path in general for modern democracy, that an elected leader uses the power vested in their office to seize control of the institutions that are meant to serve as brakes or checks on his abuse of power, and then is unrestrained and slowly dismantles democracy. And it is the case, of course, that in the 21st century, we've witnessed this repeatedly, and that not only that, the growing confidence of Trump in creating a plan, the so-called Project 2025, indicated that he was learning the lessons. And today, I want to pose the opposite question: can our politics save us from our institutions? And here I want to suggest that the question is well posed, but the answer is totally elusive at this point. And the issue is, of course, that 2 weeks later, it does appear that the Democrats have a fighting chance in winning this election. But having said that, it is also the case that we're still 95 days away, that Kamala Harris has not yet chosen her vice president, has not yet faced Trump in a debate. Of course, now there's a debate about where the debate will be, or at least appears that Trump is trying to hijack the news cycle in part by focusing the debate on his ability to dictate the terms of the debate. That there haven't been the kinds of obstacles and controversies that inevitably accompany a presidential campaign. And so I don't want to suggest that we should be confident in what the outcome of the 2024 election is. That's a fool's errand. I also want to be careful in not suggesting that should Harris win, somehow the energy that she generates in this campaign will translate automatically into a capacity to govern in a way that might begin to restore some of our democratic institutions. They desperately need repair, starting with the Supreme Court. And obviously, Joe Biden has tried to pave the way for that being the agenda for Harris should she be elected. But critical to all this will be whether or not only Harris wins, but whether or not the Democrats gain control of both houses of Congress. But even more importantly, I want to suggest it would be whether or not Harris is actually able to translate the energy she generates in this campaign into what I'm going to call a pro-democracy social movement that is sustained in the United States. And without going into too much detail, Barack Obama in 2008 rode a wave of energy into the White House. And it really did look like there was the possibility not just of him being a charismatic new kind of president, but also the organization that he had built continuing to be active in supporting his policies through his presidency and maybe even outliving him. And so the analogy, I think the historical precedent that is the clearest is the way in which the New Deal, on the one hand, emanated from the progressive and labor union movements in the United States in the beginning of the 20th century. And on the other hand, how the success of the New Deal consolidated the presence in civil society of social movements that worked in concert with and anchored the Democratic Party, and how that allowed the New Deal to really transform American society. And I think, in a sense, one of the major regrets that people interested in institutional repair in the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Electoral College. We can talk about the super conservative, the hyper conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, and what a threat to democracy it represents. But the idea that we have an 18th century constitution that has been, by hook or crook, gradually updated, but still in many ways inhibits 21st century democracy, requires that there be mobilized, ongoing support in civil society for democratic reform. And so the question really is, can Harris mobilize that? And I recognize, look, she's 2 weeks into her presidential campaign. She hasn't even chosen her vice presidential candidate. Are you really envisioning, right, Harris as the savior of American democracy? And I hate to say it, it's a born of desperation, but we desperately need it. And clearly, Joe Biden was not capable of doing it, despite some of the important initiatives, which I'll talk a little bit about today. He was, I think, accurate in casting himself as a bridge figure. And the question is, what is that bridge to, and how might Harris be able to harness the energy that her campaign has generated? So with all of that, let me pause just for a moment and note that, right, as much as we in this country are focused on the genuinely exciting, quite sensational developments head-spinning rapidity with which this race has changed and everything else that has happened since June 27th, the date of that debate between Trump and Biden. It's been a lot, but that doesn't mean that the world pauses while we get to focus exclusively on American politics. So it has been a very dangerous week in the politics of the Middle East, with Israel conducting two political targeted killings, right? One of them, an assassination of Hamas's political chief, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, right there to celebrate the inauguration of a new Iranian president, a quite sophisticated assassination, and then also striking Beirut and killing via bomb Fuad Shukr, who's one of the main advisors to Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. And so in the course of really just a couple days, Israel dramatically escalated the theater of conflict, right? Taking it to Beirut and Tehran, the capital of two of its neighbors, right? Two of its rivals. And at the same time, running the risk that Hezbollah will be drawn more fully into this war, that Iran may be drawn more fully into this war. And as you're probably aware, U.S. naval vessels are steaming to the Middle East right now to attempt to provide some security and assistance for Israel. I do think, and I've been quite clear about this, right? I am no fan of Benjamin Netanyahu or the government he heads in Israel, and that the government is increasingly showing its cards that it is not only not interested in a ceasefire in Gaza, but that it is courting escalation, probably in order to be able to sustain an increasingly narrow coalition government by keeping Israel on war footing as the rationale for the ongoing war in Gaza clearly lapses, right? So how do you remain in war footing when it becomes clear that you need to wind down that campaign, provoking another conflict? And at the same time, of course, we saw results in the election in Venezuela this week. And please note, 2024 is being lauded as the year of the election. 4 billion humans may participate in elections or may have their fates influenced by the outcome of elections in 2024. And in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, the populist authoritarian left-wing leader, has declared victory in an election that appears to be absolutely tainted, right? All of the estimates seem to be that there's no way that he could have won with the margin that he claims to have won, that he almost certainly lost, although I have to admit, I think it's a little harder to establish that with as much certainty. But nevertheless, that he stole the election is the dominant perception on the part of his rivals. It is leading Venezuelans into the streets in increasingly violent clashes. And the estimates before the election were that as many as 10 million Venezuelans might leave Venezuela if Maduro tried to steal the election. That will create a tremendous strain on Guatemala and El Salvador and Mexico, countries that are already struggling economically, politically, with criminal gangs challenging the capacity of their states. And ultimately, you can be reasonably sure that large numbers of Venezuelan, Guatemalan, El Salvadorian, Mexican uh, immigrants, refugees, asylees will wash up on the shores of the southern border of the United States, exacerbating the border crisis there. And so, it has a American domestic resonance or implication, but I think independently from that, we should be deeply concerned about the regional stability of both Central America and the Middle East, and that things got worse this week, and we need to be paying attention to that, despite the fact that naturally our attention gravitates to the election. If there's any questions about that, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. If not, I'm going to transfer attention back to domestic concerns, with apologies to the short shrift to the international stuff. Right? I haven't even mentioned the prisoner exchange with Russia that resulted in the release of several American prisoners. And very quickly, I don't have much original or significant to say about that, other than it speaks to the value of sustained diplomacy, and perhaps the fact that Joe Biden, although he's not a capable candidate anymore, may be very capable in uh, diplomacy, international relations. And given what I just said about what's happening in Israel and the Middle East and Venezuela and Central America, I think we should be very grateful that Joe Biden is able to concentrate his energies for the last few months of his presidency on foreign affairs, as opposed to having to be out on the campaign trail. So, having said that, please note, and I just think this is astounding to see. The last time we looked at the predictions for the outcome of the Electoral College vote using these complicated models that try to take into account polls and other fundamental factors influencing the election in each state. So to predict the Electoral College outcome, there was a 5 in 6 chance that Donald Trump would win the Electoral College vote in 2024. It has essentially moved into being a dead heat. I want to be as careful as possible, right? This diagram, which it may be a little hard to make out the dates on, really only takes into account less than a week. But in that week, I hope you can see the movement, right? That Donald Trump's chance of winning the election has gone from 65 to 52%, right? That Harris's chance of winning the election has gone from the mid 30s to the high 40s. Essentially, we have a dead heat in terms of the Electoral College, and that, at least according to Nate Silver, whose metrics I'm relying on here, he's a little bit more aggressive than some of the other people who do this kind of work, in the sense that he got his model running again, despite the fact that the polling is very limited. And I want to be as clear as possible. We should not ever treat polls as a secure prediction for what's going to happen in an election. They are at best a snapshot of a tiny little segment of the electorate that we try to generalize from. But nevertheless, we also very rarely get it exactly right. So that's why there are margins of error, etc. But having said that, Silver went ahead and got his model running again. He's tried to aggregate the national polls, and he believes now that Kamala Harris is actually leading Donald Trump based on the average of reliable or good national polls. One metric we can be quite clear about is that Harris trounced Trump in terms of fundraising. And please note, this is for July, right? She did this in essentially 10 days, right? It wasn't until the 21st of July, I believe, that Joe Biden dropped out of the race. Up until that point, Democratic fundraising, especially at the presidential level, had been incredibly anemic. And so in 10 days, it looks like the Harris campaign generated about $200 million in fundraising, and now has a war chest that is larger than Trump's ready to spend on ground operations, et cetera. And I would just point out, right, there's a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, a lot of unity and enthusiasm in Democratic circles. I'm going to speak for a moment about where it comes from and whether or not we should regard it as stable or ephemeral. But having said all of that, this is not going to win the election. Right? What's going to win the election? I know you'll be tired of hearing this if you're not already. Uh, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. What's going to win the battleground states is not energy at the national level, but ground game at the county and precinct levels, right? And so the fact that Harris has managed to revive Democratic fundraising, that she's bringing on board, for instance, some of the best of Obama's campaign staff, may indicate that she will now start to put in place what she needs to do to win this election. So very quickly, I think the other way to measure where the momentum is in this campaign is to look at the favorability ratings. And so I have two different metrics here. One of them is an AP NORC poll, and it shows Harris actually edging towards a net positive favorability rating, right? The last time she had net positive was back in the early phases of the 2020 presidential campaign before most people knew who she was, right? And obviously she dropped down pretty low. And more recently, right, she and Trump were close to each other. Trump has seen a bit of a bounce as a result, probably, of the assassination attempt and the Republican nominating convention. But having said that, Harris has been moving up steadily over the last year and a half and now has a substantial advantage over Donald Trump in terms of net favorability. This is the 538, and I hope you can see how rapidly Harris's favorability has been increasing, her unfavorability decreasing, again, heading in the direction, though not as close to reaching it on the 538 metrics of a net zero, of as many people liking her as dislike her. Trump has also been improving, but his gap is higher. And I think then the questions have to do with how sustainable Harris's move in both the polls and the degree to which she is regarded by the American public as a better choice, as somebody that they trust, that they have confidence in, that they don't associate with some of the liabilities of Donald Trump, and that clearly Biden was incapable of coalescing that kind of support because the age issue was eclipsing every other characteristic. And the idea that a man who is obviously incapacitated tries to hide it from you and wants to spend another 4 years in the most powerful office in the land, despite being clearly diminished, that was a deal breaker, I think, for most Americans with regards to Biden. And we'll have to see, right, whether he is able to overcome the negatives associated with the last few weeks in terms of his legacy, but he's out of the way now, at least in terms of Harris. So how much of Harris's surge is simply relief at having a less unpalatable option on the menu, right? And so there the question is, look, it looked like the menu contained two versions of 4-year-old soup. And now all of a sudden there's fresh soup on the menu. Obviously, some enthusiasm goes just into having an option that you don't know as well and aren't as disgusted by. How much of this is a honeymoon, right? And saying that it's a honeymoon, the idea is that people are giving Harris a chance, that they're open to the idea that she might be a better option and therefore are looking at her with fresh eyes. But having said that, it doesn't indicate anything intrinsic about her qualities, just the dynamics that set in when there's a new candidate. A third possibility is that this really does reflect Harris's intrinsic strengths as a candidate, that she is more collected, more calm, more energetic, more charismatic, and frankly, more appealing than either of the previous two options. And so, if that is the case, then we should expect that this trend may continue for a while. I don't want to suggest that all of a sudden a bunch of MAGA Republicans are going to convert to supporting Kamala Harris for the presidency. There's a clear ceiling, but she may continue to display attributes that attract a large number of, up until this point, disengaged voters and get them energized for her campaign. This would be the Obama 2008 scenario. And then, fourth and finally, is the question, how will she be identified? Who will identify her and how? And here I need to spend just a moment on one of the stories of the last week's news cycle, and that is obviously the appearance of Donald Trump in front of the Association for Black Journalists, in which he questioned Harris's racial identity. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think one of the main reasons Trump was doing that was simply to try to grab hold of the news cycle again, right? And so one of the striking things about the last couple of weeks is not only the energy, but simply the coverage. The attention has shifted from Trump to Harris. We live in a so-called attention economy where your ability to capture attention, whether it's positive or negative, is critical to the dynamics of public opinion formation in this age of digital and social media. And Trump had been masterful at this, had recognized, right, following his old mentor's phrase, that there's no such thing as bad publicity. But for the last couple of weeks, he's really been wrong-footed. This was his effort to regain attention. And in certain respects, what he said was so outrageous, was so racist, was so antiquated that it succeeded, right? And on the other hand, I want to be as clear as possible. It's not just an effort to pull the focus back to him. And I think we can expect that he will, if this doesn't succeed, grow more and more desperate and therefore more and more outrageous. But it's also an effort to trigger moral panic on the part of his core constituency. And the not terribly subtle or hidden message here is, what kind of person is this who wants to be the next president of the United States? Is she Indian? Is she Black? Is she either or both? She dresses in a sari at points, but she belongs to a Black sorority. She is the poster child of post-racial or multiracial America. And if that makes you uncomfortable, let me make sure that you're paying attention to the fact that that's who she is, right? And this is very much akin to the way in which Trump rose to prominence by raising the question of whether or not Barack Obama was actually a legal American qualified to be president based on whether or not he was born in this country, right? And wildly discredited, but nevertheless, it works. It pushes buttons with his core constituents. And I think one of the questions that we'll have to study as we watch this campaign unfold, and then as we do our postmortems and histories on it, is, does it work as well in 2024 as it worked in 2008 or 2016? Because at this point, 1 in 10 Americans is interracial, right? And please note, J.D. Vance tries to do the same thing by holding up a normative model of the traditional patriarchal heterosexual family and charging that Harris is a childless cat lady, right? Harris has raised 2 children. They're not her biological children, they're her husband's children from a previous marriage. But having said that, please note that approaching 40% of American families are so-called blended families, right? And so again, in 2024, does the effort to define Harris as other, as out there, as threatening, work for enough Americans to make Donald Trump a viable candidate? Because clearly this messaging repels a large portion of the electorate. And the question is, has the division, the proportion between those who are panicked into action and those who are repelled by the not so implicit racism of this messaging shifted in a way that is electorally disadvantageous to Trump? I think there's some pretty good indications in the initial polling that that may be the case. And please, again, a word of caution. These polls are few and far between. They're not conducted under the best of conditions. They're conducted under highly fluid conditions. So this is necessarily a little more speculative than usual. But what we see is, right, when we get to where the action is, the Electoral College, that Trump is still favored to win the Electoral College, but by such a narrow margin that this is now a toss-up. And of course, where the action is, sorry, right, but Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And please note that in the last 2 weeks, Wisconsin and Michigan have shifted from toss-up leaning red to toss-up leaning blue, right? So shifting from Biden to Harris has shifted Wisconsin and Michigan back into the likely Democratic fold. And on the other hand, Pennsylvania really is just a dead toss-up right now based on the polling that we have. Trump might be up by a fraction of a percentage point, but having said that, that's well within the margin of error. And then when you look at, and this is complicated, but if Harris wins Pennsylvania, how likely is she to win the presidency? 91%. If Trump wins, 96%. And so the attention is naturally focused here. And this leads back to the question of whether our politics can rescue our institutions, and in particular to the Electoral College. Because as we have talked about many times before, the Electoral College is biased. It tilts clearly in a partisan direction in terms of amplifying the likelihood that the Republicans will be able to win the election, that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States, even if he loses the popular vote. And so to begin to look at this, right, notice that when you run thousands of scenarios, right, and ask, are there scenarios in which the Democrats win the popular vote in the Electoral College? Absolutely. Are there scenarios, and please note this is 2020, this diagram is just for illustrative purposes, in which the Republicans win the popular vote and win the Electoral College vote? Absolutely. Are there scenarios in which the Republicans win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College vote? No. Right? Are there scenarios in which the Democrats win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College vote? And the answer is not only yes, but it's about a 1 in 5 shot. right? And so to then translate this into 2024 electoral terms, what this means is that if Harris wins the vote in a close vote, say by 1%, the popular vote, there's a 90% chance that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. If she wins by 2%, there's still a 70% chance that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. Once she gets up to winning by around 3%, there's a better than 50% chance that she wins. If she gets up to winning by around 4%, then it's very likely that she will be the next president of the United States. And please note, right, of course, that Joe Biden won the last presidential race by about 4% in the popular vote, but had a relatively narrow electoral college victory in which 100,000 votes going the other way might have changed the outcome if they occurred in the right states. And again, we've looked at this together before. This map indicates the electoral power, relatively speaking, of the different states, with Wyoming being incredibly powerful relative to its population, punching way above its weight, I'm sorry, California, Texas, Florida, New York being highly disadvantaged relative to their population. And the way in which this distorts democracy is not just that it lets the smaller states uh, have disproportionate power. It really means that this election comes down to what happens in a handful of states, and within those states, very frequently comes down to what happens with a few thousand voters, right? And so in a country with hundreds of millions of eligible citizens, the idea that a presidential race would be decided by less than 40,000 votes in 3 states, right? Or 60,000 votes in one state, or heaven forbid, 270 votes in a single state that had problems with its ballot. This is a product of the institutional defects of our Constitution. This is the kind of thing that we need to start addressing. And to be as clear as possible, we've spoken about this extensively before, right? The Republican Party under Trump is rapidly drifting in the direction of becoming a populist, autocratic, anti-liberal party, right? And by that I mean liberal in the 19th century sense, opposed to a free press, opposed to an independent judiciary, opposed to a civil service governed by the rule of law as opposed to purely political considerations, opposed increasingly to minority rights or to rights that protect the autonomy, liberty, equality of all citizens. And it's doing so not because that's the direction that a majority of Americans want us to go in, but because it's the direction that a substantial minority wants us to go in, and we can win races. We can win the presidency. We can win the Senate. We can control the Supreme Court while getting only a minority of the support. So again, an area where one might hope that we would get some uh, momentum coming out of this election. And I want to be as clear as possible about this. One scenario in this election is that Donald Trump loses somewhat handily. And I don't want to be predicting that. I just think at this point, at least it is a plausible scenario, and that the Republicans lose both houses of Congress, and that this perhaps finally breaks Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party, and the Republican Party will have to really carefully work through the possibilities open to it to become a party that can compete for a majority in the 21st century. And that might actually create greater openings for reforms that are long overdue, reforms to the Supreme Court, reforms to the Electoral College, with the Republican Party recognizing that its unwillingness to countenance democratic reforms in the 21st century is undermining its electoral viability. Let me not go into too much detail here. My simple point is, right, that Biden was really struggling in 2024 to win the voters he won in 2020. And so it seems to me the big question here is whether or not Harris can win back the younger voters that Biden was losing, whether she will have solid support, as the Democrats have had in the past, from African Americans, from Latinos, from other racial minorities. I think I'm reasonably confident that she will do well in terms of continuing to maintain the Democrats' gender gap, being a woman in a post Roe v. Wade environment or a post Dobbs environment. And finally, then the real question will be whether or not the voters who are 65 and older, white, uh, and with less education, right, who Biden won quite handily in 2020, will be willing in 2024 to consider voting for a multiracial woman with a relatively progressive history and message. And so, having said that, I think the question is whether, in part, Harris can strike the right balance, not simply campaign on the basis of her identity, but really be someone who is at the same time moderate and transformative, right? Who doesn't, on the one hand, trigger the moral panic around the idea that she's going to be a peak woke candidate, that she's going to want to abolish the police or be someone who rapidly accelerates the racial transformation of America by letting millions of immigrants in. Obviously, she has to avoid those traps, right? And on the other hand, to recognize that there is a deep appetite for transformation, right? We've talked about this extensively in the past. 70% of Americans want either to tear down the political and economic systems or to subject them to serious reform, right? And if Harris can sell the idea that she is the right person, a younger generation, a new leader to really bring about substantial reform, to maybe start with the Supreme Court and the Electoral College, but also to work through economic changes that create greater opportunity, mobility, and equality in the United States. That if you give her and the Democrats control of the presidency and Congress, that they will pass national legislation to protect the right to abortion if the Supreme Court is unwilling to do it. Again, I think she might be able to thread the needle, and it is a tricky one, to convince people that she's both moderate and transformative in the right ways, in the right mix at the same time. And then I think that the alternative question, right? Trump has campaigned and built his campaign on the idea of dominance and strength, right? Assuming that he would be, right, campaigning against Joe Biden, who he thinks of as weak and declining. And on the other hand, he's clearly trying to play the nativist card, right? The United States is a country that has been dominantly European and Christian, has had traditional forms of the family, and as that starts to be challenged by core demographic and cultural developments, can the state be used to preserve or restore the old racial, moral, religious order. And populism here understood to mean there's one true people and one true leader, and people who do not support the true leader are not true Americans, they're enemies of the people. Will that fly in 2024? Will it fly having seen what this was like in action for 4 years in the previous administration? Will it fly in light of Project 2025, making it much more explicit what would be involved in doing this? Let me not spend a lot of time here. We spoke a little bit about this last week. I know it wasn't recorded. Apologies to those who didn't get to see it. But I want to spend a minute or two. We can return to some of these issues, but thinking about additional issues. And as I say this, let me just highlight for a moment these 5 issues that it seems to me that having Harris in the campaign makes it much more likely will be salient or prominent in this campaign. One is abortion, right? And obviously, she has been the leading spokesperson for the Biden administration. Trump gets credit and blame for having appointed the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. But will Harris be able to use the fact that Trump has appointed Vance, that Vance has said these unfortunate things, perhaps revealing things about wanting to give specific legal and economic advantages to traditional families? Will she be able to pivot from abortion to the idea that the Trump administration, a new Trump administration, would try to use the authority of the presidency to menace those who are attracted to post-traditional lives, blended families like Harris's families, or gay marriage, or abortion, or equality between the man and the woman, or heaven forbid, the woman actually being the primary breadwinner in the family, right? That this is not just about abortion, which I maintain is perhaps the most potent, even if not the number one polling issue in the 2024 campaign, but to generalize the issue of abortion into an issue of autonomy for more diverse ways of constituting one's life in the 21st century. With regards to the economy, what does it mean for the government to work for the people? Is it still possible in the 21st century to envision the federal government doing things that are beneficial for all Americans, but especially for the middle class, for the less well off, for the white working class, for people who don't have a college education? Or does the government only work for elites and the powerful and their agendas? And I want to pivot just for a moment to the fact, right, that Biden and the Democrats succeeded in ways that I think really deserve credit and were, in a sense, quite improbable given their very narrow margin of control of Congress in really beginning to develop a 21st century industrial policy. And so for most of the last 40, 50 years, the US federal government has not tried to shape the US national economy, the neoliberal political ideas that reigned supreme under Clinton, but also Obama, obviously Reagan, and both Bushes suggested essentially get out of the way of the market and let it work its magic. And what Biden did, what he convinced the Democrats to do, was to invest several trillion dollars in right trying to manage what was happening to the economy in light of the pandemic, but also in rebuilding the infrastructure of the United States, in building a new green power structure, energy structure, and other aspects of the economy to favor environmentally sound development, and then to try to return some science and computer technology investment to the United States. And I want to emphasize, right, this is several $trillion to be appropriated over a decade. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for the American people to have the discussion: who do we trust to better administer these programs? Who do we trust now that trillions of dollars have been allocated? Because please note, right, these programs were mainly adapted, passed in 2021, 2022, and rules, etc., regulations have to be elaborated before the spending can begin. Only a small portion of the spending has begun. I think as part of what Joe Biden was fighting against is he's claiming credit for Bidenomics when Bidenomics hasn't made much of a difference in the lives of ordinary people. I think the right way to be having this debate is not to say, give us credit for Bidenomics, but look, this legislation now creates an opportunity. Who do we believe? Who can credibly make the case that they are poised to implement these policies in ways that will undo the catastrophic consequences of neoliberalism, of growing inequality, of growing precariousness for the American people? Did Donald Trump do anything to benefit the working class, to benefit the less educated, the more precarious families of the United States when he was president? Would Kamala Harris be better at continuing the course that Biden has put the country on with regards to economic policy? The other issues, I think, right, democracy or populism, it's quite clear that we have a really radical choice between two very different kinds of presidents. I actually really hope that Harris will do something that Lawrence Lessig suggested she do, which is that she pledge that the immunity granted to the President of the United States to not be subject to criminal prosecution if they violate the law, she would waive on the campaign trail and waive again on her first day of office and waive again if there was ever any criminal prosecution, and that she challenged Donald Trump to waive that immunity as well. Immigration and economic and racial anxiety are obviously going to be extremely important in this campaign, given what just happened in Venezuela. I think we should be very worried about that. Inflation and economic precariousness, I think we should return to. But let me mention one other issue, which I think is worth concluding on, and that's climate change, right? And so part of what Harris has to do is to bring young voters back out for the Democrats, to convince people that if they want a sustainable future for the United States, there is a clear choice. And I'm sorry, I think I superimposed diagrams. I didn't mean to do that. And so this is I'm afraid, less clear than it should be. But what this diagram shows, and it was done when Biden was still the candidate, is the difference between a Trump presidency and a Biden presidency based on what they have pledged to do. And what is clear is that neither one of them would get us to the net zero emissions that the US has pledged under the Paris Accords for 2050, but that Biden would get us substantially further. And right, the substantially meaning 4 billion tons of emissions just in the next 5 years. And I hardly need to note to you that California, in suffering from the fourth worst wildfire in its history right now, uh, mainly uncontained, that this is very early in the year, reflective of the fact that we're having the hottest temperatures ever recorded in the history of the planet, right? The hottest day in history occurred just 10 days ago. And so let me just say one more thing. I hope that Harris would be able to really point to this as a central contrast to her. The last thing I'll say, and this can be a topic for another class, but please note, right, that the January 6th case may be back in court. And it may be back in court. The preliminary hearing date is now set for August 16th to determine when the next phase in this hearing will occur. The next phase in this hearing concerns whether or not the recent Supreme Court case, Trump versus the United States, allows immunity for each of the alleged elements of the conspiracy to defraud the people of the United States of the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. And I believe that there's a real possibility that this will go to court, this aspect of the trial, between now and November, right? And that when it does, although obviously it's not the same as a actual criminal trial in which, right, they're litigating whether or not the charges have merit. The focus will be, is the President of the United States immune from prosecution for having overturned or tried to overturn, allegedly tried to overturn the outcomes of a presidential election? And so what Trump's lawyers will be claiming in court is not that he didn't do it, but that even if he did, it was legal for him to do it. And this might be a really interesting, salutary, important aspect of the next 90 days. Let me stop there. Obviously, I kind of sprinted, but I was able to cover a lot today. Who wants to start us out with a question or a comment? Flossie, go right ahead. Do unmute yourself, please.
I have a lot of faith in Kamala. I I feel vibrations that are positive. She's going to open up a chance for people of color, all colors, to vote for the first time, not only a woman, let us say a person of color, the same kind of feeling we had when Obama ran, the the excitement, the wonder, the enthusiasm, the hope in the country. I begin to feel that again. A person of color, a woman of color, and then there will be a struggle, but there is so much hope. That's what I'm feeling now.
So I have a question for you, Flossie. Are you willing to move to Pennsylvania? My comment is right that I think that, and this is what I tried to differentiate in that slide where I was looking at her growth in approval, that for a large segment of the Democratic electorate, right, having a viable candidate is just in and of itself energizing. You add to that the idea that in many respects, she appears to be a transformative candidate. She could be the first woman president in the history of the United States. And by the way, the first biracial president in the history of the United States. And it would certainly restore confidence in the idea that America is moving in a progressive direction. Having said all of that, please note also that Donald Trump is counting on the fact that this will trigger panic on the part of white working class people in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Arizona, right? And so my roundabout, let me get to the direct point. Flossie, you're not the person who needs to be open to considering that Harris is a viable, energizing, attractive, good candidate. If she didn't, frankly, have that effect on you, I would be very worried, given who you are and where you are, right? She really needs to have that, probably in not the same degree or the same way, with some white suburban and working class women in Pennsylvania for this to be her election.
My sister-in-law came from Sunbury.
Uh-huh.
That's the middle of Pennsylvania. And the folk there were very nice. And they were not even anti-Semitic.
Interesting. Yes, that sounds like a little bit of a low bar. And look, I do happen to have some friends and acquaintances, given where I live, who are Trump supporters. And I do have to say that some of them are very nice. And they really, I don't think, like Trump. And especially they don't like, when he goes the direction that he went last week in really trying to stoke racial divisiveness in this country, right? Let me put this one other way. I want to suggest that Harris opens up the possibility of a more unifying political candidate, right? And I think one of the things that Obama opened up as a prospect for many Americans was a period of less divisiveness around issues to do with especially race, but then also privilege, access, opportunity, and that what Trump has done is to again and again instrumentalize divisiveness in ways that ultimately play out to his advantage. And that Harris opens up the possibility that we might be a little bit less divided over the next 4 or 8 years. And I do think that divisiveness, polarization, the degree to which we are hostile, the literature on this, uh, was that all kinds of vocabulary, but moral delegitimation of each other as fellow citizens. That's not a nice place to be. It's not a good place to be. It might be exhausting. And so it might be for Harris an opening to be able to say, look, let's not go back to the Trump years. We all lived through that already. And whether you like him or dislike him, you've got to admit that it was fractious for us as a country. Let's come together a little bit. And I do think there might be an opening for that. And it might work with some of the people I know who don't like Trump's persona, but are deeply skeptical of democratic policy objectives. All right. Anybody else want to come in today?
Yeah, it's Birgit.
Please go ahead, Birgit.
The importance of a vice president,
Yes.
choosing one of the states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. So, what do you think that will have?
So I did a little bit of research on this. I've got a slide, so I'm going to go back into my slides. And the people who are really wonky about this, and let me see. Oh, maybe I'm not going to find my slide. Where is it? Give me a second. I know it's here somewhere. Here it is, right? People who are really wonky about this suggest that Josh Shapiro is the best choice. And this starts with the idea that Pennsylvania is kind of the fulcrum in this election, the single most important state. And then Shapiro might increase Harris's chance of winning the Pennsylvania race somewhere from half a percentage point to guaranteeing winning. If it's only half a percentage point, she goes up to nearly 50% chance of winning this election, right? If he guarantees it, she goes up to winning the election more than 50% probability, right? And then, of course, there's the contrast between, right, Shapiro and J.D. Vance. I didn't get his image on the board, but I got his ideological profile. And Shapiro doesn't, quite thread the needle on everything, but he is a moderate candidate, right? And whereas, right, Vance is an extreme. And then I'll just point out that one of the things that the people who study vice presidential picks suggest is that vice presidents very rarely assist presidential candidates in winning campaigns, right? And when they are chosen for their electoral advantage, there seems to be an inverse relationship between how important the state is that they're there to carry and the likelihood that they're actually going to impact what happens in that state, right? I mean, and did LBJ help Kennedy win Texas in 1960? I think we can debate that till the cows come home. But having said that, the idea that what you want to do is avoid a vice presidential candidate choice that on the one hand does political damage to you. And it appears that Trump may have failed that test. And on the other hand, not having a vice president who you can work with, right? And I don't know, but it appears Trump might have failed that test with Vance in the previous vice presidential choice. Again, I think there's so many openings for Harris here. Please note the Washington Post has a story today that 50%, half of Trump's cabinet from his previous administration does not support him for president in 2024, and that includes his own former vice president. So bringing the character issue front and center, the liabilities, the dangers to institutions that we all rely on in the way that we relied on a federal right to abortion until a couple of years ago, speaks to the dangers involved with Trump. Doesn't answer the question. But my short answer to the question is, I think the real question here is, does Shapiro damage Harris? And I don't see the scenario in which he clearly does. And so he's probably a safe pick. And then maybe he gives her a little bit of a bump in Pennsylvania, and that's enough to make him the choice. We'll know on Tuesday. We can talk about it next week. Okay. Wendy, were you raising your hand? No, because you're still muted, so I got to hold the space bar down. There you go.
Just a funny comment about Kamala and parenthood.
Yes.
Her stepchildren call her Mamala.
Right. Yes.
So.
Yes. Yeah.
She's doing the job.
Yeah, and look, I think, for the people in this room, we're very excited. Right. And we just have to remember, we're not the people who she needs to win. If she can't win us, this whole thing is over before it started. Right. All right, everyone. Wonderful being with you. And it does feel good, right, to have a little bit better news to focus on, to not have this be a doom and gloom session as it so often is. Who knows? But hopefully we may have some other stuff that we'll enjoy talking about going forward. I'll be there in a couple weeks to see you in person. Looking forward to that as well. Be well and see everybody next Saturday. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
My pleasure as always. Thank you.